In the late summer of 1944, as Allied forces surged across France following the USPEC of the D-Day, one city stood apart from the rest, not because it could change the outcome of the war, but because of what it represented. Brest, a heavily fortified port on the western tip of France, had been transformed by Nazi Germany into a symbol of defiance. To Adolf Hitler, it was not just a city, it was a fortress that must never fall. Brest was part of the Atlantic Wall, a vast network of coastal defenses stretching from Norway to Spain. Massive concrete bunkers, thick gun emplacements, hidden artillery positions, and underground tunnels turned the city into a near impenetrable stronghold. German engineers had spent years preparing for exactly this moment, an Allied invasion that would test every inch of their defensive doctrine. But the true strength of Brest was not just in steel and concrete, it was in the mindset of the men ordered to defend it. Hitler had issued direct commands. Key ports like Brest were to be held to the last man, the last bullet. Retreat was not an option. Surrender was unthinkable. These cities were declared Festungen, fortresses, and their commanders were expected to embody absolute loyalty and unwavering pride. The German commander in Brest was a product of that system. Educated in the rigid traditions of Prussian military culture, he believed deeply in hierarchy, discipline, and honor. To him, war was not just about survival, it was about status, image, and legacy. Even as the situation deteriorated, that belief would shape every decision he made. By September 1944, the reality on the ground was far less glorious. American forces had already broken through Normandy and were advancing rapidly across France. Supply lines were stretching, strategies were shifting, and for the Allies, capturing ports like Brest seemed crucial for maintaining momentum. But Brest would not fall easily. The city became a battlefield of attrition. American troops faced relentless artillery fire, sniper attacks, and a maze of defensive positions that turned every street into a deadly trap. Progress was slow, costly, and exhausting. Buildings were reduced to rubble. Entire neighborhoods were wiped out. Yet inside the German command structure, something strange was happening. Despite the destruction, despite the encirclement tightening day by day, many German officers clung to a belief that they were still in control. Reports were filtered, reality was softened, and optimism, however detached from facts, was maintained. The fortress mentality was not just physical, it was psychological. The commander of Brest continued to present an image of calm authority. His uniform remained immaculate. His routines stayed intact. Even as supplies dwindled and communications broke down, he held on to the outward appearance of order and superiority. It was a dangerous illusion. Because outside the bunker, American forces were adapting. They learned the terrain, adjusted tactics, and applied constant pressure. What had once been seen as an unbreakable fortress was slowly being reduced piece by piece. And as the walls of Brest began to crumble, so did the gap between perception and reality. What remained was a city on the edge of collapse and a commander who refused to see it. That refusal would soon lead to one of the most extraordinary and revealing encounters of the entire campaign.
By the time Brest became a primary objective, the momentum of the war in Western Europe had already shifted decisively. After the USPEC of D-Day, Allied forces surged inland with speed that even their own planners hadn't fully anticipated. German defenses were collapsing in sectors, retreating in others, and struggling everywhere to adapt to a new kind of warfare: fast, flexible, and relentless. For the Americans, the advance across France was both a triumph and a growing logistical nightmare. Fuel, ammunition, food, Everything had to be transported from the beaches of Normandy across hundreds of miles of increasingly stretched supply lines. This is where ports like Brest became strategically important. On paper, capturing Brest would provide a deep-water harbor capable of sustaining the Allied advance into Germany. It was supposed to be a key piece of the larger plan. But war rarely follows the plan. The responsibility for taking Brest fell to American forces under the command of Troy Middleton, a calm, experienced officer known for his steady leadership rather than dramatic flair. Middleton wasn't the kind of general who sought attention. He understood something many didn't. Taking Brest would not be quick, and it would not be easy. As American troops approached the city, they quickly realized what they were up against. This wasn't open countryside anymore. This was a fortress engineered for defense in depth. Every approach was covered by artillery. Every road could be ambushed. Every building could conceal a sniper or a machine gun nest. The Germans had turned Brest into a layered defense system designed to bleed any attacking force. And bleed it did. The Americans faced brutal resistance. Progress was measured not in miles but in yards. Each advance required coordinated assaults, artillery barrages, and often hand-to-hand combat. The city itself became a shattered maze of rubble and ruin, where visibility was limited and danger was constant. But Middleton's approach was different from what the German commander expected. Rather than launching reckless assaults to prove dominance, he applied pressure methodically. He allowed his forces to adapt, to probe weaknesses, to slowly tighten the noose around the city. It wasn't about speed, it was about inevitability. Meanwhile, the German side continued to operate under a completely different mindset. The idea of a fortress Brest was not just a defensive strategy, it was a belief system. German officers had been conditioned to think in terms of honor, rank, and absolute obedience. Even as their situation worsened, they clung to the notion that holding out was a form of victory in itself. Inside their command structure, reality became distorted. Reports of American strength were sometimes dismissed. The scale of the encirclement was downplayed. There was an unspoken assumption that something would change, that reinforcements might arrive, or that the Allies would falter. But none of that happened. Instead, American forces continued to close in, cutting off supply routes and isolating the city completely. Communication with the outside world became unreliable. Resources dwindled. The defenders were no longer part of a larger war effort. They were trapped inside a shrinking pocket. And still, the outward appearance of control remained. For Middleton, this contrast was clear. He understood that the battle for Brest was not just physical, it was psychological. The German commander was fighting to preserve an image, while the Americans were focused on results. As days turned into weeks, the gap between those two realities grew wider and more dangerous. Because eventually, pressure reaches a breaking point. And when it does, it doesn't just destroy defenses, it exposes the truth behind them.
Deep beneath the shattered streets of Brest, far from the constant thunder of artillery, the German command bunker still functioned as if the war outside could somehow be managed, controlled, even denied. Thick concrete walls insulated it from explosions, but they could not fully block out the reality creeping in from every direction. Inside, the atmosphere was tense, but strangely disciplined. Maps still covered the walls, officers still gave reports, orders were still issued with the same formal tone that had defined the German military for decades. On the surface, it looked like control, but underneath, cracks were beginning to show. The city above them was being systematically destroyed. American artillery pounded defensive positions day and night. Buildings collapsed into the streets. Fires spread uncontrollably. Entire sections of Brest were reduced to rubble. Communication lines were cut and repaired, then cut again. Messengers became more important than radios. Every piece of information that reached the bunker was delayed, incomplete, or filtered. And yet, the illusion persisted. The German commander continued to project calm authority. His uniform remained immaculate, his posture rigid, his tone unwavering. To the officers around him, appearance mattered, discipline mattered. The idea that they were still in command of the situation mattered more than the reality itself. But reality has a way of forcing its way in. Supplies were running dangerously low. Ammunition had to be rationed. Food became scarce. Medical facilities were overwhelmed with wounded soldiers, many of whom could not be evacuated. Fatigue spread through the ranks, not just physical exhaustion, but something deeper, a growing awareness that this battle could not be won. Still, surrender was not discussed openly. The doctrine imposed by Adolf Hitler had made one thing clear: fortress cities were to be held at all costs. To even consider surrender was to risk being labeled a traitor. For many officers, that fear was as powerful as any enemy force outside. So instead, they adapted in a different way, not by changing strategy, but by changing perception. Reports were softened before reaching the commander. Failures were reframed as temporary setbacks. Enemy strength was sometimes underestimated, either intentionally or subconsciously. It created a strange feedback loop where decisions were made based on a version of reality that no longer existed. Meanwhile, outside the bunker, American forces continued to tighten their grip. Encirclement was nearly complete. Escape routes had vanished. Reinforcements were not coming. The defenders of Brest were no longer part of a broader front like the Battle of Normandy. They were isolated, cut off, and slowly being crushed. And inside, the psychological pressure began to build. Some officers started to question the situation quietly, in hushed conversations away from superiors. Others doubled down on discipline, clinging even harder to routine as a way to maintain order. The contrast between what they were trained to believe and what they were experiencing became impossible to ignore. The bunker, once a symbol of strength and control, was turning into something else entirely, a sealed environment where reality was delayed, distorted, and ultimately unavoidable. Every explosion above ground was a reminder. Every delayed report was a warning. Every passing day reduced their options. And yet, the commander held on to the idea that authority, image, and rank could still shape the outcome. It was a dangerous belief, because when the moment of truth finally arrived, it would not be decided by uniforms, titles, or traditions. It would be decided by reality, and reality was already at the door. By mid-September 1944, the end was no longer a question of if, but when. The once proud fortress of Brest had been reduced to a broken landscape of shattered beton, twisted metal, and silent ruins. The American encirclement was complete. There were no escape routes left, no reinforcements coming, no strategic purpose remaining. The battle had already been decided. Only the final act was left to play out. And yet, inside the German command structure, the Privichka of formality and hierarchy still held strong. When the moment of surrender finally came, it was expected to follow a certain code. For the Germans, especially those shaped by old Prussian traditions, war was not just about fighting, it was about protocol, status, and dignity, even in defeat. The way a surrender was conducted mattered almost as much as the battle itself. But what happened next would reveal just how disconnected that mindset had become from reality. The German commander did not emerge from the ruins like a defeated man. There was no visible sign of collapse, no outward admission of failure. Instead, he appeared composed, almost theatrical. His uniform was clean, carefully maintained despite weeks of siege. At his side was his dog, a symbol of control,
routine, and perhaps an attempt to preserve a sense of normalcy in a completely abnormal situation. It was a striking contrast to the devastation surrounding him. American soldiers, exhausted from weeks of brutal urban combat, watched this scene unfold with a mixture of disbelief and напряжение. They had fought through every street, every bunker, every defensive line. They had seen the reality of the battle up close, and now, standing before them, was a man who seemed to be acting as if none of that had truly touched him. Then came the moment that would define the entire encounter. Rather than acknowledging defeat in a direct or humble way, the German commander made a demand. He wanted to see the credentials of the American officer accepting his surrender. Not just his identity, but his rank, his authority, his legitimacy to receive such a capitulation. It was a request rooted in a very specific worldview. In the German military tradition, rank was everything. Authority flowed strictly from hierarchy. A surrender was not simply a practical act, it was a formal transfer of honor from one officer to another of equal or higher standing. To surrender to someone of lesser rank would be, in their eyes, unacceptable. But this was not the world he was in anymore. Standing opposite him were American forces led by Troy Middleton, a commander shaped by a very different philosophy. The American military culture placed far less emphasis on rigid formality in moments like this. What mattered was outcome, not ceremony. Victory was defined by results, not ritual. The demand for credentials hung in the air, heavy with implication. It wasn't just a question, it was a final attempt to assert control, to preserve dignity, to maintain the illusion that rank and protocol could still dictate the terms of reality. Even in defeat, the German commander was trying to operate within a framework that no longer applied. For a brief moment, everything paused. The ruins of Brest stood silent around them. The soldiers on both sides waited. The war, in that instant, seemed to narrow down to a single exchange between two men representing two completely different ways of thinking. One rooted in hierarchy, image, and tradition. The other grounded in practicality, confidence, and quiet authority. What came next would not involve shouting, threats, or weapons. It would be something far more powerful. Because sometimes the most decisive victories are not won with force, but with a single, perfectly delivered response.
For a moment, the German commander's demand hung in the air like a challenge. He had emerged from weeks of siege with his uniform immaculate, his dog at his side, expecting formality, expecting recognition. He wanted to see credentials, as if a piece of paper or a title could somehow restore the dignity that had been stripped away by the relentless advance of American forces. But he was about to discover that he had miscalculated in the most profound way possible. Major General Troy Middleton approached with calm, measured steps. He didn't shout. He didn't brandish a weapon. There was no need for theatrics. The battlefield had already spoken. Weeks of urban combat, relentless artillery, and meticulous strategy had created a reality that could not be argued with. Middleton understood the weight of his presence alone. The surrender was not a negotiation, it was a statement of inevitability. When Middleton finally addressed the German commander, it was with an understated authority that carried far more power than any title ever could. He did not belittle, he did not rage, he simply confirmed the obvious. The Germans had lost, and the Americans were in command. His words, delivered with precise calm, stripped away the layers of arrogance and illusion that the commander had built around himself. In that moment, the psychological impact was devastating. The German officer, so used to controlling the perception of events, was confronted with a truth that could not be ignored. All the rituals, all the demands for recognition, all the carefully maintained appearances, they meant nothing in the face of reality. The fortress had fallen, the defenders were surrounded, and the American general standing before him embodied the undeniable authority of success. What followed was not chaos, but a quiet unraveling. The arrogance that had defined the German officers' approach melted away almost instantly. Soldiers who had clung to the illusion of control finally understood the situation. The surrender, once formalized, was not just a transfer of territory, it was the collapse of an entire mindset. Middleton's response had achieved what weeks of combat could not alone, the total dismantling of the enemy's pride without a single shot fired in that moment. The psychological lesson of Brest extended far beyond that single exchange. It showed that confidence and composure could outweigh aggression, and that understanding the mindset of your adversary could turn even their most desperate tactics against them. Middleton's restraint highlighted a fundamental truth of leadership, that the way you carry authority often matters more than the authority itself. The surrender became a case study in turning intimidation into clarity, in converting arrogance into acquiescence, and in demonstrating that calm decisiveness can create irreversible outcomes even before physical victory is complete. As the Americans secured the city, the legacy of that exchange lingered. Brest was a ruin, but it was also a testament to the impact of disciplined leadership. The fortress may have fallen, but the true victory was psychological, an enduring example of how the right words delivered at the right moment can turn an enemy's pride into submission and a battlefield into a stage for a single, decisive act of authority. The Siege of Brest ended not with fanfare, but with the quiet assertion of reality over illusion, a moment where the arrogance of one man met the unwavering composure of another, and the result became history. It was a reminder that in war, as in life, the most lasting victories are often those that require patience, perception, and the courage to act with calm certainty.